Well, hello, Chuck, and how are you today?
Well, I'm well, Marty, and once again, let me wish you a happy Trafalgar Day.
Ooh, thank you. Well, that puts it very specifically on a date, so I'm not certain when this podcast is coming out. Probably in November.
Right, people can look it up, but it's the third week of October.
Fantastic. So you and I were having a really awesome conversation recently about some of your experiences as a lecturer,
Yes,
and one of the things that I got curious about was I've never heard you lecture. For all of our
count
conversations,
your blessings, Marty.
um, but as someone who's been a speaker for a number of years and done a number of speaking engagements, there are certainly ones, if you asked me, what are my favorite ones? I have some favorites. In your distinguished career, you must have some favorite moments, some favorite times at the podium. And I'm wondering if you could relive a few of those favorite times at the podium for our listeners.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd love to. Probably my I don't know if favorite is the right word, but one of my most impactful upon me was the speech that I gave in the cathedral at Moncton when, as the commanding officer, I laid up the regimental guidon. And unfortunately, I spoke from the heart. And afterwards, everybody wanted my speech. I said, I'm sorry, but I spoke from the heart. I didn't have notes. And the pastor, the Anglican bishop, said, "Don't worry about it, Colonel. We have a recording system so that we can record all of our homilies." And I said, "Oh, thank you, Your Grace." And he went to the sacristy and came back and said, "Nobody turned it on." And I mean, I broke the heart of all the vets because they were in the cathedral weeping because I had obviously touched a nerve. So I'm not necessarily a favorite. In terms of favorite, in a lighthearted sense, one of my favorites is years ago, one of my subalterns, who is now actually a deputy minister, was commanding the recruit school in Saint Jacques. And he invited me to come to the school for a professional development day and to deliver a lecture on Auftragstaktik and maneuver warfare. And he had broken his training into morning for the officers, afternoon for the NCOs. And it was, I think it still is, the largest command for a lieutenant colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces. So we had a huge cadre of officers and NCOs. So I delivered the morning lectures, and we all went to lunch together, and then we all went back to the theater, and I started my afternoon lecture for the NCOs. And one of the things I do when I lecture, and I've been doing this for years, is although I put a question slide at the end of the lecture, I always tell people at the beginning, please don't wait for the question slide. If I've said something that upsets you, causes you to not understand what I'm saying, confuses you, whatever, raise your hand, interrupt me. It's okay. And I'd love to answer your question rather than have you worry about this and not listen to me after that. So I was about, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes in. This Vandu Sergeant Major raises his hand. Yeah. Excusez, monsieur. J'ai une question. Oui. What can I do for you, Sergeant Major? And we didn't know each other. I knew a lot of them in the audience, but I didn't know him. He said, and his body language was like, yeah, something's wrong here. He said, so you lecture all the officers in the morning, but we have a separate lecture now, why? Why didn't we all sit together? Why didn't you just give us one lecture? Because the lecture is about leadership. Yes? I said, that's a very good question, Sergeant Major. And the answer is a very simple one. It's because NCOs are smarter than officers. And so I had to dumb it down for the officers. I had to create a better lecture for you than for them. Well, the audience broke up. I broke the tension because you could feel guys are like, geez, he's challenging our guest speaker right off the bat. But it was a comical way to get out of a tense situation, but it was also based on truth because, okay, there were master corporals in the audience, but the majority of the audience were sergeants and warrant officers. And then, the two ends of the bell curve, master corporals, master warrant officers, and one RSM. On the officer's side, right, the same bell curve, but the high point in the bell curve were like 2-year captains, right? So there were 1 or 2 lieutenants, a whole bunch of captains, mostly very young captains, and then like 6 majors, right? And so I had to pitch my speech to that group. But on the NCO lecture, I had to pitch my lecture to guys with 25 years service. So I wasn't going to talk down to them, right? I wasn't going to tell them in the vernacular how to suck eggs. I had to be careful, right? Because you speak to your audience. So that's one of my favorites.
I love that because it does speak to how we talk differently about leadership to whom we are talking leadership.
Yes.
And I just had a conversation the other day, and I was in it, and someone was saying, "Oh, no, 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 no. We've got the topic of leadership in our conversation." And when I saw the material they were presenting me, I went, well, okay, that is leadership material. But it was kind of like, for someone who's been studying leadership for a lot of years, when I looked at that, I was like, this is the kindergarten of leadership. You're not wrong, but you're incomplete.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, what are some of the incomplete things that maybe the first lecture wouldn't have had, that the second lecture would have already had? So when we're talking to our audiences, because it is one military, and we are all going for the same objective, but how do you discern how you're going to talk to the audience differently?
I guess I'm formed not only by my experience, but also by where my education on leadership began in a formal sense. And I guess if I had to pick a spot, it would have been at so it would have been as a recruit at the Royal Military College, and I was introduced to this idea that was popular in the Canadian Forces at the time. We don't talk about it much anymore. It was called the leader-follower situation model, right? That
I'm familiar. Yeah.
yeah, it's sort of gone out of favor,
Mm-hmm.
but uh, over the years, I've thought a lot about that, and it makes a lot of sense. There are problems with that model, but from my perspective, to get to your point, how do I shift my emphasis depending on the crowd I'm speaking to? I look to the audience to see what's their experiential uh, level. So if I'm talking to RUSI, we talked about the Royal United Services Institute, then I've got retired ambassadors, I got retired senior officers, I've got uh, CEOs in the crowd. I'm not going to start at the basic level. If I've been invited by somebody to come and speak to the corporal's mess, then I've got to make sure that I speak to them in language that they can immediately relate to, not pull out their pen or open their phone app and say, "Joe, what does the word experiential mean?"
Mm.
Right? And it's not because they're stupid. It's just because they're young and they haven't had a lot of experience, a lot of them. And, the 6 guys in the crowd that understood what I was saying doesn't make up for the 27 that are sort of scratching their head saying, what's with the officer speak? Right. So the other thing I look for is I ask myself, what's the emotional intelligence of the group? So to go back to the earlier example at Saint Jean, the emotional intelligence of the officers who were instructors was much lower than the emotional intelligence of the warrant officers. And that's the way it should be in our system because, you know, I remember after giving up command of my reconnaissance troop in Cyprus and moving off to become the assistant adjutant, my warrant officer, in saying goodbye to me, he said, "Well, you're now officially stamped because you're skipping trained," because warrant officer skipping was my troop warrant. because, he said, you're now certified, you're skip and trained. And he prided himself, and he retired as a warrant officer, many, many years as a warrant officer. And he was outstanding. And his measure of success wasn't that he uh, never became a sergeant major, because he never became a master warrant officer. He was very proud of the fact that he had successfully trained, dozens of officers to be good officers. And among those dozens, like 4 or 5 of them, we went on to command the regiment. And so he put his mark on us.
I absolutely love where you're going with this. And of course, I retired as a petty officer, first class or warrant, with no ambitions beyond that. I loved what I did, and I did what I loved. But it's interesting. You talked to me about a story a little while ago about battlefield promotions.
Oh, yeah.
For the German and the British, and how they each handled when the officers for that particular group were eliminated.
Yes.
And the senior NCO had to stand up. And they had 2 different ways of doing that. And what can we learn? Maybe so if you would maybe tell that story here, that'd be great. And maybe a little bit of what we can learn from that emotional intelligence around that.
Sure. So I've got a few examples I can draw upon. So this all started with me making a comment to you that the unofficial motto of the Prussian army, so we're talking about the 19th century, was better no officer than a bad one. And it may seem obvious that you're far better off not to have a commissioned officer leading you than to have a bad commissioned officer leading you. And yet, in spite of the fact that that's common sense, the Canadian Armed Forces, based on our British heritage, the Americans the same. If the officer gets killed, somebody gets a battlefield promotion, because we have it locked in our head that, not necessarily platoon commanders, but certainly company commanders have got to be commissioned, right? And certainly battalion commanders have got to be commissioned officers, even if they're underranked, right? Well, the Prussians didn't feel that way. So there are cases where that tradition lived on in the German army in the First World War. There are examples of entire battalions, because it was a slaughterhouse on both sides. And there were battalions of German infantry where all of their officers were killed because they led from the front and they got shot. So killed or wounded, but they were out of action. And so the battalion sergeant major became the commanding officer in the British Army and Canadians. When that happened, then they would give somebody a battlefield commission. So they would take the sergeant major and say, you're now commissioned as a captain, and no, you're underranked. You're going to be the battalion commander until we can bring a lieutenant colonel forward. Right? And the Germans would do the same thing, because the Germans had a leadership reserve, Führungsreserve, where they kept a bunch of leaders out of battle with the sole purpose of sending them to command when the other guys got killed. But in the meantime, the sergeant major would be the battalion commander and called the battalion commander, but not given a commission. And the reason was, well, you're not qualified for a commission. You're qualified to lead this battalion, but you're not qualified for a commission. So when we get a chance, we might send you to officer school so that you can get a commission. But in the meantime, you're going to be the battalion commander as a master warrant officer. Compare that with our tradition where, the officers get killed. And so somebody pins the second lieutenant bars on a sergeant or a warrant officer. And okay, that may work in battle. He's got the skill set. The Germans felt the same way. But then, he gets promoted to the next rank up. He's got no preparation for being an officer, because being an officer is so much more than leadership in battle. And then perhaps fails, falters, and could be punished. It's a dumb system from that respect. I remember General Radley Walters. Some of the listeners may know who he was. He was the Allied tank ace in the Second World War. Most people don't know this, the Allied tank ace, all those Americans, all those Brits. The Allied tank ace was a Canadian. He had, I think, General Rad. I think he had 19 kills. Now that sounds like a lot but when you compare him to Captain Wittmann, SS, who had 123, a little different. But he had been fighting so much longer, and he'd been fighting on the Soviet front. So, but what General Rad came ashore in Normandy as I believe, could be wrong, he came ashore as a captain, but I think he was a squadron second in command. And in that system, in our system, the squadron second in command was left out of battle because squadron commanders died. And so the most experienced captain was left out of battle, so he'd come forward. At the end of the first day of fighting, after coming ashore, the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, which had been converted to armor, every officer in the regiment, with the exception of 2, I think Rat said, was either wounded or dead after one day. And so the system proved itself. They didn't have to commission anybody because they had kept sufficient officers out of battle that the next day they could move forward and then start preparing, to help the wounded go back to their. So these are things that we tend not to think about in peacetime, because on exercises, we tend not to kill anybody, which is something that when I was a CO, I did routinely. Normally I killed myself. I did so on purpose, usually because I wanted anybody who was ever my second in command. So when I was a tank squadron commander, and then when I was a SEAL, did the same thing. The last big attack of the 8th Hussar battle group, which was the largest battle group in NATO, I killed myself unexpectedly during the assault. My regimental 2IC, who was back in the regimental command post, was an old friend of mine. We were lieutenants together. Great guy, Murray McClure. And I said to my sergeant, I said, you need to call 0 and tell them that you don't know what's happened, but you can't wake me up. And you don't know if I'm dead or what. And then sort of wait 5 minutes. And the assault is ongoing. And then say, he's dead. CO's dead. See how long it takes for Murray to come forward. And Murray came forward, took my tank. They dragged me out. He took my tank and completed the assault. And, not to be rude, but, I went to Murray afterwards, and, he shook my hand and he said, I'm going to have a hard on for like 3 days. Thanks.
Well, you bring up something really good there. And I really like this because we've got a few minutes left in our podcast. And I was just wondering, because what we're talking about here is contingency. So we started with the topic of how we do in terms of lectures, but our lectures have brought us to this space around how we evolve.
Yes.
And even this podcast has evolved. It evolved from one space to another. What can we learn about contingency? Because that's a huge question around what's happening today. So we're growing a force. We're growing a force today.
Yeah.
We're talking specifically about Canada. Globally, we can see forces growing. Everybody's growing. What can we learn about contingency in a space when we're going from A to B? Let's say double. I'm not saying we're going to double. I'm just saying if we doubled today, what are the things we need to think about what we have, and what are the things we need to think about for a doubled force?
Well, because you ask such good questions and I give such long answers, we haven't got time for me to give you a complete answer to that question. So let me shorten the question and therefore shorten my answer, because we've only got 5 minutes left, right? So I think the starting point for this would be for us to put more emphasis in our education and training of our leaders, whether they're officers or NCOs. Put more emphasis on contingency planning and understanding what Moltke famously said, that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, right? and less emphasis on actual planning. Because, right, I mean, I spent a career teaching. If I wasn't commanding, I was inevitably teaching, right? When I was in uniform. And the amount of time that we spent teaching people how to plan was completely disproportionate to the amount of time we spent teaching them to react to their plan falling apart. And I think there's a message there. And the message has got to be, of course, we have to teach planning, but as part of our planning education, we need to frequently destroy the plan purposefully, as instructors. So give them 10 minutes to come up with a plan, let them introduce the plan, give orders, whatever, launch, and then 5 minutes later, change everything. If paralysis sets in, one of two things. The individual wasn't ready to do what you asked them to do, or you were bad at teaching them, or both.
What I'm hearing as a coach there is the introduction of functional conflict, where you actually create the function of adding conflict to the plan, where you ask everybody, what do you think could go wrong? And then allow everyone's ingenuity to come up with those things. Because we all know when you make a plan, it looks great on paper, and 5 minutes in, you're like, whatever that was, sure, you start being creative.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But yeah, functional conflict can definitely help us prepare for the next tomorrow.
I agree. This is a great topic. Maybe we should do a part 2, because I have written about this extensively and would love to talk about it more.
Okay. Well, then why don't we close today? Any final thoughts for today?
Final thoughts for today. Be good to your body. When you go to Trafalgar Weepers, be careful how much you drink.
Okay. Then for our listeners, thank you for listening today. Be good to your body and enjoy your week, and we'll see you at our next podcast. Thank you so much, Chuck.
Thank you, Marty.